Hi, and welcome to this one-off on metadata. This is going to be a mixture of a style guide and kind of a compare and contrast of different types of file names and description layouts, just to kind of get a broad sense of like how different people are doing things and why they're doing them that way. Just as a jumping into it kind of thing, I don't really think there's a right and wrong way to doing metadata, and it's really something that needs to be tailored around whoever's both archiving and whoever is using those files. So all these ideas are valid, but I do think there are better ways of doing things, mostly based around the idea that you want to be able to make snap decisions about what's worth auditioning to and what's not worth auditioning to. So I think it's most important that you're able to look at the file name and know, like, if you're looking for a slot machine, for example, that the file is a slot machine and there's different actions of the slot machine, like just putting the coin in the slot, pulling down the handle. Is it a sequence of those things? Like, that's what I need to know from a piece of metadata or from a description or maybe a file name even. But you also know that slot machines are in casinos, so I want to be able to know that when I'm looking at a file, is it a casino or is it a slot machine? And if it is a casino, I know as an editor it's not worth auditioning to all these casino recordings, because what I'm looking specifically for is someone maybe sitting in a slot machine pulling down the handle. So that being said, let's just jump into it and look at some different types of file names. So in this example, we're looking at a file name named airplane by and just a random string of letters and numbers. So in this method, you're basically just using the file name to look at a general folder and be like, okay, this is an airplane by, this is a slot machine, this is a dog barking. You just need the broadest overview of like what the files are in the folder. And then this number is basically just to keep those files from not repeating, and also it serves a couple different functions, but I'll get into that. So say you had an airplane by underscore 01, airplane by underscore 02, or let's go even more rudimentary. You just try to put a folder of different airplane bys together. They're just called airplane by. Well, in a folder structure, you can't have two files named the same thing, so it does have to have the 01, 02, 03. But in a broader context, if you're looking at your library and you had maybe like 10,000 files and 100 of them maybe were airplane bys, there's no doubt that using that system, you're going to have multiple airplane by 01 or something like that, and then you have another airplane by 01. So a serial number, essentially, you're always going to have a file and a serial number. And even though this is like basically impossible to memorize, there's no way I would be able to memorize a number like that or a string of numbers and letters like that. It's still useful for identifying that is the specific file. That is that file, absolutely, no matter what form it takes. Like if I put a flanger on it and the file name is like that with an underscore mod because it's coming out of SoundMiner, or like in Pro Tools and it gets overwritten with some sort of tail thing, I know that's the source file. So whenever I look up that string of codes, I'm always going to find that file, and that's kind of where that use of that file naming is. It's not the only way to do codes on files. Like if we're going to skip ahead a little bit to number 3, this is a totally valid way of having a unique identifier, but also that it has a little bit more information going for it. So LN might be the library code, 03 might be the disk number or like the series number, and this number would be the track number. So it kind of depends on the manufacturer, but in a context of a sellable library, this might be a really good way to go, because it has all these little bits of information that I can be like, okay, so I like this manufacturer. This is the library number, maybe. And I'll be like, okay, so library 3 from, I don't know, Soundies, that fake company there. Library 3 from Soundies. Those guys put out these really good sounding rock crashes, or in this case, an airplane buy. And I'll be like, oh, let's listen to Soundies airplane buys. So SS03 airplane buy, that pulls up like all the airplane buys, and I'm like, okay, that is exactly what I was looking for. So that might be a little bit easier to memorize, and you can go even further by having abbreviations that make more sense. But in this case, we're looking at a catalog that was in a CD form, so this is library name CD3 track 32. But codes like this can be really handy for a lot of different reasons besides just finding a specific code because you have it memorized. So going from the top, we've already talked about this one. Number 2 is a file name that's a little overkill, in my opinion. You have your serial number, great. You have a manufacturer name, or code basically, recordist name, in this example, or RENA. That is a way of labeling files. I'll get into that a little bit later on track 4 of this playlist, but CU for close-up, it's exterior, it's an airplane buy, it's a Boeing 737. This is like a full description, and that could be really handy if you're the kind of editor that works entirely out of folder structures. This might be the best way to go for you, because you literally have every little bit of information. And more so, what's useful about this way of doing it is that if you, for some reason, overwrote all your metadata on the file, you'd be able to pretty much place all that back from the file name. So it's effectively acting as its own backup. I think in a modern sense, we don't really need to do that because most people keep backups of their files, and they can go back to their backups if something gets overwritten like that. But who knows, you might not pick up on that until like 3 years down the line. It's like, oh my god, I accidentally got rid of the descriptions on all my files and I never realized it, and I've already backed up over those backups. So maybe that's not a bad way to go. I don't know. The one really big drawback of doing it this way, though, is for Macs, this isn't really as big of a deal because there aren't character limits, but on PCs and older DOS systems, there's character limits to how long a file name can be, and more so for modern Windows machines, the file path can't exceed 255 characters ever. So a file like this in a folder called like recordist library, date, all this stuff, like all those characters start adding up really fast, and if you try to zip those up and send it to somewhere else and they open that and that's in a folder, it just won't unzip. Or you can't move this directory to a deeper directory because there's too many characters in the file names. So there's a good benefit to keeping your file names relatively short. It doesn't need, like, this is still relatively short, but if you have a pretty long description, that could end up really screwing up someone's day when they're trying to unzip your files, or like when you're trying to send someone something you worked on. So it makes sense to keep things relatively brief in the file name, and you have so much more room in your metadata to like expand on that. So we're gonna go on to 4. Since we talked about 1, 2, and 3 a little out of order, but in this example, we're using a recordist name. I've abbreviated that to RENA. And there's a lot of different methodologies for abbreviating names, but in my experience, I've found that taking the first 2 letters of their first name, the first 2 letters of their last name, is a pretty consistent way. Usually you have that information, or hopefully have that information, and it's a little bit more effective than trying to like go to the person and ask for their middle name. A lot of times, by the time everything's happened, it's really hard to get that information. Middle names aren't as commonly available, and it's better than doing a 2-letter abbreviation because like KP mine, who knows, like I might run into someone named like Kimberly Partible or something like that, and she's also KP. So having 4 letters is a little bit more consistent way to keep things short, but also like avoid having very common run-ins like that. That's all my thoughts on abbreviating names. If you have a first name and last name and it's the same as someone else's first name and last name, sometimes it's good to take the first letter of their first name, the last 3 letters of their last name, because it's more uncommon for people to have shared last names than it is to have first names. But that's generally a good rule of thumb if you're going with this style of file naming. Furthermore, rather than using the code from example 3 or examples 1 and 2, this one's using a date code. And this can be an effective way when paired with a name, because it's very unlikely that someone is going to go back in time to record something on the same day they already recorded something. So by doing something like this, and even further, you should probably put a track number in somewhere along this, maybe it's the last characters in the name, or maybe after the date. But this is a good way to keep files organized, and you have a little bit of information. It's like, oh, I recorded something in December, so maybe I'll do like Rena 2018-12, and that'll pull up everything I did from 2018 in December, and then I can go through and it's like, oh, there it is. So from a recordist standpoint, that might be a useful bit of information to use. In all these examples that say airplane by, it might even be worth expanding on a little bit more, like example 5. So example 5 is kind of an example of someone who's working with the file name, but in the context of SoundMiner more. So they're basically looking for a broad overview in their file name. So this one's saying like this category is vehicle, it's an airplane by, it's a FAST, and it's a Boeing 737. That's probably enough information to be like, okay, that's good enough for me. I'll take a listen to it. And then some people like to even tag on the microphones at the end, especially people are in more recent times using like Sanken CO100s, because that's a kind of giveaway that it's a ultra high frequency recording and that it's something you might want to slow down. In this case, RMS 191 is a mid-side mic, and if you know that little bit of information, you'd be like, okay, so this is a mid-side, so I might have a good mono channel, or I might have a good stereo channel out of it. In my opinion, this kind of information can go in the microphone channel, but not everyone works out of SoundMiner or a metadata management program. So that might be something you want to put in your file names, depending on how you work and how you operate. My personal system involved, I don't ever look at the file names personally anymore, so I've been using this system, and unfortunately to say, this is a system I used to use and am very embarrassed by. But that being said, it's not, there is logic to it, and there is a reason why you might want to do that, but I don't think it's a good idea. So moving on, we're just going to take a look at descriptions now, and I'm going to kind of hide the file names effectively so they don't become a little distracting here. So from top to bottom, honestly, I think this is almost ordered in my preferences of doing descriptions. I personally, in my own opinion, descriptions are the most important field for me, just in the way that I edit, but not everyone edits the way I edit. But I think in general, when you're building a description out, you want to order all your information in the words that most quickly communicate what's in the file. So in all these examples, it's an airplane by, and it's a Boeing 737, because I would want to know, and I'm cutting an airplane, if it's a military jet or if it's a Boeing 737, because they're all very different sounding. Propeller plane of some sort. It's taking off. It's a pass by overhead, and it's a high pitched turbine whine. You might even want to go even further and say it's a commuter jet. Or maybe you could say it's a passenger plane or something like that. There's all little bits of information that you can add on top of what you already have in there. In my opinion, it's cleaner to try not to put too much information, but not put too little information. And that's kind of a part of the art form of doing library work. You want to put keywords that people are looking for to edit the sound. And that can get really opinionated and difficult to like really nail down what the right thing to do is. But over time, like, I would say this is like adequate, but you could go a little bit further with it. But I think at some point you read the file and you get about this far, and then you're like, that's what I'm looking for, it's not what I'm looking for, and then you audition it, and then you get all the rest of the information by listening to it. It's kind of like saying a picture is 1,000 words, a recording is 1,000 words. So breaking this down, seeing the airplane by is all caps, and that's because all caps is visually a little bit easier to read than lowercase and uppercase or title case or anything like that. We have a visual break using a space, a dash, and a space, and some systems see dashes as illegal characters, so you gotta make sure that you don't put those in file names. But the space dash space breaks it down so you see airplane by, and then you don't start reading Boeing 737 because it doesn't look like it's a continuous part of that word. Boeing 737 taking off. All this is in caps case, all of it's separated by commas and spaces. That also works as a visual break, but it's a smaller visual break than this space dash space. And it's enough that because you have that break, then the next capitalized word becomes a keyword in your mind, and you're saying taking off, pass by, overhead, or something like that. You see the word pass, and you can kind of assume that the next word is going to be by, and then overhead might be a little overkill, so you might just skip to the next comma or the next break, say high, and then you might not know what that is, but you could assume if you logged it, you'd know that things starting with high are usually high pitched. You might even want to put a comma between high pitched and turbine whine, but I feel like that's a fragment sentence, so it's kind of worth doing. So I think this is a pretty successful file description, but what this next one does is it's going to be all lowercase, ignoring that. And I find this airplane by is harder to read, but what I like about this file more than I like the other one is it's a comma space space, and it's giving a bigger visual break between the sentence fragments. So it's a little bit easier to see taking off separate from passing by overhead, separate from high-pitched turbine whine. And this is kind of a opinion thing. This is also like something you may or may not want to do depending on how if you're working with scripts and you're using space and you're sometimes like in the process of doing cleanup, that can screw some stuff up. But visually, that might be the most effective way to write out some of these descriptions that are very fragment sentence based. But to each his own, and I think this is almost as equally effective, so that's the way I personally have been archiving. Next, this is an example when we're taking off the title case off the words. Airplane's the only thing capitalized in here, but I find it's harder to see things like taking off. I don't separate the words as much. It becomes kind of a visual, like, static, because it's all just like a string of words rather than like each word being deliberate. Some people will also be like separating comma space first letter is capital, and then like an example, taking off would be lowercase, pass would be capitalized, by overhead would be lowercase. And that's another way to like visually break up the words so it doesn't become kind of text mesh. So in the last two examples, we're going to open up the file names again, because this is a style of doing descriptions that relies on reading both fields for the file name and description. I personally find this is a lot slower to do and a little bit more frustrating to deal with, because I'm looking to my left, I'm finding airplane by, and then I'm looking to my right, and then I'm reading the description. And I find that slows me down so much that like I don't want to deal with it that way. And then I'm just ignoring the description entirely, and I'm looking entirely at the file name. It doesn't really have enough information for me that I'd be very happy with that, even in this situation. And like where you have a lot of information or a rich amount of information in your file names, like I still find it easier to read airplane by and have like that separate from my category abbreviation, stuff like that, my microphone information. I mentally parse searching through descriptions and specifically looking for titles a lot better than having everything title case and a string of words like that. But that again is entirely dependent on the editor styles and what they want to do. So in this example, we have airplane by, and this is a full written out sentence, and I find these to be a little frustrating to deal with personally. But in ambience recordings where you have a lot going on and someone's maybe approaching it from a acoustical ecologist kind of point of view, that might be a good way to do it. I've never come across a file where I'm like, oh man, having all these extra words in there has really helped me like sort out what I want. But to each his own. And this last one is just basically the same as all these others, dropping the airplane by and kind of relying what's in the file name to like get you that bit of information, and then you'd have a more descriptive example of what's going on in the file in the description. So those two parts I think are always the most important for like being able to quickly edit, but I find that filling out as many fields as you can when you're archiving your files is really important. A lot of that just is like, it's really hard to figure out who the designer or the manufacturers are further on in the line. Sometimes knowing the microphone might be a good thing to know, especially if it's a mid-side mic and that's not labeled anywhere and it's still raw mid-side. That kind of information can be really critical to communicate, because those kinds of files need to be decoded still. Or ambisonic and what format of ambisonic it's in, if it's raw or if it's in a FUMA or like AmbiX or something like that. Finally, category and subcategory are two fields that are very debated, and I genuinely don't think there's a great all-encompassing way to do them, because category is going to be very dependent on what kind of work is being done at the facility you're working at. Like people who work with whooshes a lot might have that be its own category, and whooshes are its own category, versus like someone who's working with basically little to no whooshes, like in a very realistic standpoint, they'd be like, okay, fire is the category, whoosh is the subcategory. It's all just going to depend. And this is like one of those things I feel like as a community we're going to develop more over time, and it's going to evolve, and we're going to share our categories lists and be like, oh yeah, it makes a lot more sense to keep your whooshes as its own category rather than putting that in each of the different materials. But to each his own, and I'm excited to see what people do with that in the future. Some other just like kind of throwaway notes to say, it's might be good to have an archivist initials and date somewhere in there, wherever you want to put it that makes most sense to you, whether it be in notes or in user comments or something like that. And that's just so if you're working to a certain version or a style guide now, and 20 years down the line it's completely different, all your file naming's different, you want to conform, that might be a helpful like guideline to follow, and know where you were at that time because you have some sort of backed up file of your style guide from 2018. And then other than that, just use your best judgment. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. I'm always happy to help. Take it easy.